Dear colleagues, we would like to invite you to our second panel discussion on investors' outlook on Ukraine. And I would like to introduce you our moderator, Neil Buckley from Financial Times, who will moderate this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Maria, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let me repeat that welcome to the second session of this morning's conference. As Maria said, I'm Neil Buckley, the Eastern Europe editor at the Financial Times, based here in London, although I've found myself shuttling backwards and forwards between here and Ukraine for much of the last 8 or 9 months. And had visited quite a number of times before that. The first panel gave us, if you like, the geopolitical and macroeconomic framework for what's happening in Ukraine, which seems to be sometimes changing by the minute, as we've seen this morning. This panel aims to look in a rather more detailed way at how investors view Ukraine, what the opportunities are, what the risks and the hurdles are. It might seem almost paradoxical to be holding a conference on investment opportunities about a country which unfortunately has a war on part of its territory. But I think the fact that so many people are here today shows that appetite still remains, and you're also all familiar with the idea that of investing in the downturn in order to be able to take advantage of the upturn. And I'm sure many of us hope and believe that that upturn will soon come. It's also true, I think, that while the conflict in the East affects the overall economic outlook for Ukraine, there are nonetheless tremendous opportunities in this country, which has really been underinvested in compared with many of its neighbours in Central and Eastern Europe in the past 2 decades. And there are large parts of the country which are not directly affected by what is happening in the East. Moreover, there is a leadership and a government in place in Kiev which is genuinely committed now to the reforms that are needed to make the country a more attractive place to invest. And we've got a distinguished panel with a lot of hands-on experience to consider these issues today. Let me briefly introduce them to you. Richard Segal, who is next to me, is responsible for fixed income strategy across emerging markets at Jefferies International. He previously worked in a similar capacity for Knights Libertas and Renaissance Capital. Katre Saad in the centre is partner and investment manager of Alcott Capital Management Limited. She is originally from Estonia, but spent, I think, much of the last 6 years in Ukraine doing business there. Alcott is involved both in private equity and alternative investments, active in the agricultural sector and also in IT. Then we have someone you'll recognize from the first panel. Shevki Ajuna is the head of the Kiev office for the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, has been in Ukraine for the last 16 months, I believe. Chose a very interesting time to take that particular position. And at the end of the table, Volodymyr Skladanyvsky is partner and vice president of business development at Elex, which is one of the largest IT services and products vendors in Ukraine. He's very much involved in leading strategic development initiatives and currently heading the UK office, I believe, of that company. So what I'm going to do is ask each of the panelists just to make a few introductory remarks on their particular sectors. We have a nice mixture of people involved in financial investment, portfolio investment, as well as direct investment. So I'd like to ask each of them to talk a little bit about what they see as the main attractions and main challenges on a broad and on a specific level. Perhaps if I start with Shevki Ajuna to talk about the broad picture, and then we can focus a little bit more on particular sectors of interest?
I will, I spoke briefly, but we are involved across the entire spectrum of industries in Ukraine, be it agribusiness, be it manufacturing and services, be it infrastructure, transport, telecommunications, real estate. And we are also working, under the present program with the sovereign projects in Ukraine. And recently, we have made available a 200 million second tranche facility for the transport project, the Kiev approaches. We're working very sort of intensely on the gas transport system financing together with EIB to facilitate the reverse gas flows. But our program is a 1 billion euro a year program, and we are very much on target, as I mentioned earlier, to achieve that. So, I think we have enough money for investors. We are investor-driven organization. We cannot originate transactions ourselves. So that is why we are here to sort of hear your intentions, investment intentions, and to convey to you that we are open for business. Of course, for investors, the key question is whether or not the investment climate is improving. And answer to that, if you segregate the political, the geopolitical and the terrorist activities in the East from the equation, yes, clearly the investment climate is on a positive trend. The rule of law is going to be more and more the rule of the game in terms of protecting investor interest, and the corruption will be rooted out. So I see a positive opportunity for investors to invest in Ukraine.
Thanks very much indeed. We'll obviously be returning to some of those themes in more detail in a moment. But if I move on now perhaps to Richard, is it Segal or Siegel?
Siegel.
Richard Siegel, sorry, I said it incorrectly. Perhaps if you could give us a view of the portfolio investor's perspective, if you like, in the fixed income area and elsewhere, on what the outlook is for investment in Ukraine right now.
Okay, well, actually, in different countries, my name is pronounced differently. In fact, in Belarus, they pronounce it Shagal. His family name is a bit more famous than mine. There's an actor who goes by the same name. I think I'd rather be a Chagall than a Siegel from that perspective. But anyway, if you're considering Ukraine as an investment destination, it makes a big difference whether you're talking about companies that have already been able to issue in the markets or companies that are going to become prospectively involved. If you're a prospective borrower or capital raiser at all, you really need to have an organization such as the IFC or the EBRD behind you because the political risk is too high. But for us and for our clients, if a company has already issued, if its prospects are reasonable from a medium-term perspective, then it's simply a matter of risk and return as in any other market. Of course, the risk is lower in most other countries, but on the other hand, the prospective returns will be far lower. But I should also add that if you compare risk and return in a country such as Ukraine, it's arguably a lot lower than in a country such as Venezuela and also Argentina, although Argentina is very political at the time being, which suggests that from a global perspective, investors are a lot less worried about the future of Ukraine than the future of Venezuela. Venezuela has a lot of internal social conflicts, but certainly no internal military conflicts and no longer any cross-border military conflicts. So if we look at Ukraine in that kind of global perspective, the global comparison, it's a lot calmer if you measure it by what investors think, how markets price the risk, than in some other countries around the world. In addition, I should say that every conflict is regrettable that causes any kind of human suffering. I think no one would disagree with that. If we look back through history, there was a time when Indonesia was no-go to many investors. Not only was there the economic crisis, but there was the East Timor issue. There was a lot of insurgency action in the very large island of Aceh. We currently have an internal conflict running in Nigeria. I could say the same about Iraq. And we heard from JKX earlier during the Q&A, but there are many very well-known companies very actively involved in the Kurdistan region. And there's a lot of investment still into portfolio investments into some of those companies, even companies which are very large and very listed. So the difference I would make is that if you want to come to the market for the first time, it's not impossible, but it's very difficult. But if you are already in the market and have equities listed, or you have fixed income investments, or you're a government which has issued in the not too distant past, and you have an IMF agreement in place, then it's very easy to find investors who will come and meet with you, or alternatively have a conference call. You still produce your quarterly earnings like normal, and if you are offering a better risk-adjusted return than a company, for example, perhaps even the UK, we have fallen angels in this country quite a lot. If you were to look throughout Europe in the past 2 or 3 years, among the best investments would have been Greek telco, Hellenic Telecom. Almost no one would have given this company the possibility of remaining current on its debt throughout the crisis. And if you invested in their equity, you would probably had one of the best returns in any sector, let alone in a recovering country, let alone in the Eurozone. But just a final word about investing in Ukraine. Most of the country, thankfully, is peaceful, albeit not all of it. But even though countries in the center of the country, such as for Expo, have their own distribution, conflict is not in that part of the center of Ukraine. Agricultural exporters in the west of the country are severely affected because the crisis has a big impact on capital flight, has a big impact on interest rates and the exchange rate, and any kind of political risk that has that kind of national macro impact has an impact on how well they can finance operations. For the negative for now, but if the conflict can be resolved relatively soon, then those problems should dissipate.
Richard, thank you very much indeed. I think some useful comparisons there with other international situations and making the useful point that there are other countries where conflicts are going on that nonetheless are attracting significant investment. Let me turn perhaps now to Katri Saad. Katri, when we were talking earlier, you were telling me your fund is very involved in the agriculture sector, also in IT. Clearly, both of those are promising sectors. Perhaps if you could give a brief summary of how you see the opportunities in those areas.
Thank you. Just to maybe correct a little bit, Alco Capital Management does manage public equity funds and private equity and discretionary mandates. Through our public equity funds, we've been investing in Eastern Europe, and unfortunately, it's very difficult to invest in public equity in Ukraine because the stock market is very small. I think the average turnover of the Ukrainian stock market is around 2% of the GDP, while at the same time Turkey is above 40, I think it's around 44% of GDP. Russia is around 37% of the GDP, which could be comparable to Ukraine. So it's very difficult to invest in public equity in Ukraine for us. And hence we started an alternative investment fund in 2007, investing directly in the agricultural sector. We invest both in Russia and Ukraine. And the investment vehicle, I'm myself a large shareholder of that company. We have currently around 70,000 hectares in Ukraine, and it's listed on the Stockholm stock market. Why I point this out is that we actually found that when we created this vehicle that it was easier to start a business from scratch because particularly at that time in 2008, the agriculture sector needed a lot of consolidation, and that's the work what actually we did as an investment manager. We consolidated the small farms to add value for the land plots. And I must admit, through this experience, I spent almost 6 years in Ukraine, living 50% of the time in Ukraine. And I think it sounds almost like a cliche, but today I think that this economic situation in Ukraine almost had to become worse in order to become better. Because during the last couple of years, during the previous government, it was actually very difficult to conduct any normal business in Ukraine. I think it was mentioned in the previous panel as well, it was almost impossible. And what do investors, both local and foreign investors, want? They want, of course, stability, they want to have predictability. There needs to be a legislation system which you can rely on. There was a lot of talk about trust before. I think it all comes down to that you need judiciary system which is working, and you need to have a law enforcement procedure that is also working. I've been in several conferences during this year, and there have been a lot of course, we probably speak more about the reforms and how they are going to be implemented. And actually, in practice, what can be done for the businesses to make it actually more investable and the climate more investable and investor friendly. I mean, one example. For example, you could consider how do you start? You probably have to start from the top. You need to start looking at different judges. Can it be who needs to be changed? You need to increase the salaries for public servants so that the system starts working. Until we have a reliable legal system and a law enforcement in place, it's actually very, very risky and tricky. But when it comes to the investors' outlook, I think in general, Ukraine is a fantastic country. I mean, it's a large consumer market. You have 46 million people. Agriculture and food industry is, of course, very important. And there is huge potential to make agriculture more efficient. We just looked another day. For example, Ukraine average wheat production has been 3.5 tons per hectare since 1991 until today, and wheat is harvested on 6.7 hectares. And if you would say Europe has the highest wheat production, it's around 7 to 8 tons per hectare. If you would increase the levels of wheat production in Ukraine to the European Union levels, which is perfectly doable, and I can say that from my own practice because I've been out on the fields and I know the conditions, then you would actually increase the production by up to 40-50 million tons of wheat production. That would be an output of $8 billion. I mean, you don't often think about it, but I mean, there are things that can, as soon as you actually start investing and increasing the efficiency, you can do a lot of things.
Thanks very much indeed. A very good sense there of the size of the potential opportunities in some of the key sectors in Ukraine. Let me finally turn to Volodymyr. You're in senior management of a Ukrainian business. You were working before this crisis, working through this crisis. What's your perspective on the outlook for investment in Ukraine right now, as someone who's absolutely involved in that?
Well, I think you'll find my outlook. Thanks, Neil. I think you'll find my outlook rather optimistic. I like to think of myself as a technologist, so that's perhaps the perspective I can give you. I'd like to quickly mention three things: the dynamics of growth, the social impact, and the hope. So if you talk about the growth, so say if you look 15 years ago, if you talk about IT industry in Ukraine, that was largely non-existent. What we have now, we have more than 500 companies that are involved into what is called outsourced IT services, established companies, about 2 billion cumulative revenue. We have more than 100 R&D centers, research and development centers that large international corporations opened in the country, employing thousands of people. We have finally about 2,000 technology startups. So I like to think in terms of exponential growth curve. We're close to that stage where the growth is becoming noticeable. So I'm very optimistic about it. Now talking about social impact of that. So there are estimates that there are about 100,000 software engineers in the country. Now I remember 5 years ago we talked about less than half of that number. And there are estimates and ideas and initiatives to double it in the next 5 years. So what does it mean practically? That means that there are 100,000 families that are perhaps less dependent on local economic circumstances, and they're as well less dependent on things like local bureaucracy or corruption. And it's no coincidence that the industry and many of those people were at the heart of the profound social reformation that the country just is coming through. There is clearly there's ambition and there's talent. One note I'd make is that perhaps in Ukraine, for somebody young and talented, there will be less of career choice than the same person would have here, and for that reason we have many talented people going into the industry, which makes it strong. Finally mentioned hope. I think that Ukraine still needs to reinvent itself and find as it integrates into global economy. And there are many ideas and many interesting opportunities. Agriculture is one of them. But I think how I like to think about technology. I like to think of technology as something that brings hope, that makes people's lives better. And I just think that it's very positive, and for that reason, I think that Ukraine has all the chances to become If you look at the structure of Ukraine's export for the last couple of years, and you look at IT exports, that would be a very small part of it. That would be probably about 2%. But I think you have all the chances for the IT industry to become a much significant part of that, and we probably, I hope that would be in the top probably 3 areas that Ukraine specializes in. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. As we're looking at the outlook for investment, clearly we need to address how the government is doing at the moment in terms of tackling the hurdles, the risks that are involved for investors. This is something that Katre Saad already referred to, but I'd be interested in getting some views from the panel. How is this new government doing in terms of improving the investment climate? Is it managing to do that despite the conflict that's going on in the East, which clearly is proving a great source of distraction for senior officials? And are there quick wins that can be made in terms of reforms? And if so, what are they? And is the government trying to address those kind of areas? Is there anyone who would like to particularly address that?
Yeah, if you allow me, I'll take a... I mean, first and foremost, I think this government is clearly resolved to reduce and eventually eliminate the corruption that has brought, as I said earlier, this country to where we are today. And to that effect, laws are being proposed. There's a law that Dmitry Shimkin has announced going to Parliament. There's a law in respect of the Business Ombudsman initiative that EBRD has started and hopefully will have in place before the end of the year for sure, that will look to unfair business practices and corruption complaints of the local and international businesses. And this comes from Poroshenko top to the government at each level. And indeed, these laws will pass before the election. I think that shows how the present parliament is committed to it. There's laws that have been passed in respect of improving the procurement in the public sector. I think, again, another source of huge corruption is being addressed, and creating a level playing field for all businesses to bid for public service contracts is being assured. The tax code is being simplified by reducing the number of different taxes that businesses have to pay. The e-government that will bring the ultimate transparency to everything is being implemented in a variety of departments. There are a number of other things that I can and the panelists can mention, that this government is making a very determined effort to open the opportunity for people to invest. Because what Ukraine has suffered from in the past was people were not really allowed to use their entrepreneurial abilities, spirit, to invest and create wealth. That is the way to liberate this economy, is to create this level playing field, reduce unnecessary intervention from government, but create a proper regulatory environment for people to invest. And that is what is happening. Of course, when the destruction of the resources is addressed, and the terrorism is brought to a manageable level, all those additional resources will be brought to bear on the infrastructure that will be needed to support that investment.
I'd be interested if there are other perspectives from the panelists. That's obviously a very positive view, but we have in the past seen governments come in with quite ambitious reform agendas and not manage to realise them. So some other governments arrive talking a good game and ultimately not delivering. Richard, you've taken the microphone. What's your sense on this? Do you think that the momentum is such that this can continue, and this is a government that can finally deliver on what Ukraine needs?
I mostly focus on macro issues as well as company-specific, in particular private sector company-specific issues. But in the spring of 2013, I had the opportunity to meet with a number of government agencies planning and managing special projects, the state highways organizations and the like. And it seemed readily apparent that there were a lot of well thought out plans to develop key sectors, to renovate the rolling stock, to renovate the highways, to build technology hubs in some of the larger cities which have some of the better known educational institutions. In addition, even though there was clearly a lot of corruption associated with hosting the European Football Championships, I would dare say it was far less than was the case in China, Brazil, Russia, and certain other emerging markets, maybe some developed markets, although maybe that's just because the numbers were smaller. So there certainly was that renovation of infrastructure, airports, roads, stadiums, and connections. So let's not say that the system was entirely rotten, but I would also say that these projects failed not just because of poor governments or corruption, but also because of the very overwhelming bureaucracy, lack of finance, lack of time, because the last government had to decide whether it was going to sign the EU association agreement or whether it was just bluffing and holding out for a better agreement. There are a lot of the plans in place to make this leap forward, but it's still, I think, the case that they have to focus on the top-down issues. They have to focus on the macro first to a large extent, and then they can focus on the micro. You can have the best micro plans in the world, but as we've learned throughout emerging markets, that if you don't have the macro sorted out, if you don't have the political stability, then you'll either get a backsliding in terms of governance, or else you get very rapid changes of government, as we've seen in many other parts of Central Eastern Europe, and you have great plans, but the people who are in power to implement them they just lose influence, they lose power, and you just get nowhere. So that's what I would add. I'm fairly optimistic from the future once this conflict is resolved, but let's not focus too much on the micro measures until we get that sorted out.
Katja, you would like to add to that?
Yes. Well, I agree with that, what you have said, but it has also been said that the current government inherited the worst corruption of any countries in the region, really, so it is a very tough job, and I'm actually quite optimistic for the first time that I believe that once the conflict is solved, they will actually carry out the deep reforms. What concerns me mostly is the timing. a couple of things. First of all, at the same time, these difficult reforms need to be pushed through during a very difficult time when the economy is really going down, inflation is very high, currency is depreciating. It's a very tough domestic situation, and then you have to push through these reforms. At the same time, you're really reliable on the external financing. You need to make sure that you get that external financing. So my question is really how quickly and can all these reforms be carried out? I was in a couple of months ago only on a panel where the new head of tax authorities was present, and a Swedish company was there, and he was asking questions. Why are you telling us all these things that you're going to make these changes? I have tax inspection as we speak now going on, and the new government has been in power for a long time. So basically 6 months down the line, the companies get the tax inspectors, and they don't feel the change really down in the companies. And his comment was that it will take time. It's an interaction between different authorities. Prosecutor office and tax authorities need to work together, and obviously these things will not happen overnight.
Did you want to add to that, Volodymyr?
Sure, thank you. Well, first of all, I share some of your optimism about the current government. Just also wanted to add. I agree there's very positive dynamic of the conversation with the new government, but also I think what's important is that there are local initiatives as well. So for example, in Lviv, where our company is headquartered, for a few years, but it's always intensifying. There's for example, local industry association, what it's called IT BPO club, IT cluster, and we actually work, and many other local companies work with the city mayor and the local administration to see firstly what we can bring to the city in terms of infrastructure, how we can help to improve it, and then from the other side as to what the city can offer us in terms of say education improvements or infrastructure improvements. So I see these things happening, and I'm optimistic about it.
Great.
If I may just add, I think I'm not worried about whether or not the politicians will stick to their word, because now we have discovered the people power in Ukraine, and they are the ones who are going to hold everybody to account, and therefore I'm the optimistic that I am.
I think that's very true. On the other hand, though, some of the reforms will hurt, and therefore people power can be double-edged. If people find that they are suffering as a result of these kind of budget cuts which are necessary, austerity programs which are necessary but in some ways painful, is that something, given the people power that now exists, could that actually threaten to push the government off course on some of these issues?
And this is where I think the communication of the objectives, the plan, the strategy comes into play, and it's extremely important. I think all of Ukrainians realize where the country is now and what needs to be done. I think what they have to see is clearly that the past rules will not apply anymore. So there's going to be a clean society. I think if Ukrainians see that from their government, from their parliament, from their president, then they would be ready to suffer this very tough adjustment, which is unavoidable. I think, unfortunately, all that money has been stolen from the country and is somewhere, and nobody else can pay for it than the Ukrainian people.
Let me raise one other issue, just linked to that. Ukraine is known as and is a very oligarchic economy. It's very oligarch-dominated, and part of the reason for the demonstrations in Kiev over the winter was to, if you like, break the hold of the oligarchs. But what we've seen through political necessity in recent months is, in some ways, some of the oligarchs have got even more powerful because they've taken regional governor positions. So what is the outlook for, nonetheless, readjusting Ukraine's economy over the time, making it less oligarch-dominated? And how much is that oligarch dominance something that is an issue for investors looking at the country at the moment? Is that something one of you would like to deal with?
Well, I think if you're thinking about some ideas, what I tend to think is that more entrepreneurism. So if you look at Ukraine regionally, perhaps central and particularly Western Ukraine is more. So if you talk about medium, small business, the proportion of that would be much higher, and I would hope that increases over time. So I'd really like to see reforms that encourage that. And the other thing is globalization. So the more we become interconnected, the less there's an opportunity for a local autocrat to dictate things.
I think the level playing field, the same rules applying to everybody is key to that. And gradually that landscape of dominance will change, because people that will invest will be by definition more flexible, more agile than these big behemoths that have sort of formulated, that have been in place for a long time. So that is the key. I think it's a political question to what extent the Ukraine would want to go back and query, what happened in the past. But I think one would have to look forward, and one would have to ensure that the people have the right opportunity to enrich the country and themselves.
Sure. So it's really about putting the right legal and regulatory framework in place to create that level playing field. Yeah. Katri?
Yes, I agree, and I think that it's such a big country and in need of so much investment. So when I've been actually actively working in Ukraine, it has. I don't think that in long term will be an issue, but it's also very. Ukraine has so many different regional differences, so I think it also depends in certain regions where this is more influential, and in which, for example, in Western Ukraine, I find it is much less influential.
That's actually one of the areas I'm less concerned about. They're mostly on the same page. They see common interests. I think to a lot of them, it was a zero-sum game before. If your rival gains, then you lose by the same amount, maybe even a bit more, and vice versa. It could fall back to the old ways before, but at least for the time being, they all see a common goal in the country, staying together, because if they don't, then they all lose. And we can contrast this with many other countries in Central Europe and also in Eastern Europe and also Turkey, in which case it still is a zero-sum game, in which if one oligarch loses, or if a government-related entity wins, then an oligarch loses. It certainly isn't the case now for Ukraine. But also at the same time, I would say that because they're focusing on the preservation of their businesses and maintenance of what they have, it is opening up the ground for a lot of the bottom-up entrepreneurs who can develop their own businesses without interference. I think it was quite famously known that during the last regime that whereas historically if you were under the radar screen, then you were able to survive as long as you didn't grow and become too prominent and encroach on the territory and the profits of someone more influential. But in Ukraine, in the last regime, there wasn't really any radar screen. The shakedown was pretty much across the board. So I think from that standpoint, we can take some encouragement that the oligarchs are thinking along the lines and are all on the same page, and let's hope it lasts.
Let me move on to another related issue. It's almost been overlooked in some ways in the last few months, but the European Union Association Agreement and Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Area Agreement, which in some ways was the catalyst, or rather the fact that wasn't signed last November was the catalyst for the protests over the winter. That agreement has now been signed and could even move to be ratified within months. What benefits will that agreement bring? What concrete impact will it have? And what kind of advantages does it present? We're looking to explain to the audience who are interested in putting money into Ukraine exactly what that agreement means. Is that something you could talk about?
Well, I think it sort of is a clear anchor where Ukraine's future is going to lie. And it's not, perhaps some people thought that there was the ultimate objective to sign a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement. It is only the starting point of reorientation of Ukraine's industry, business towards the market economy of the Western world. So in that context, there's a lot of road to cover. There's a lot of assistance needed to Ukrainian enterprises to get on that path, because one of the key broader macro difficulties that the Ukrainian economy is facing is the low value added nature of its output, its limited export markets, this great dependency on Russia. So all these have to change in what we call in a fundamental structural way. And this deepened DCFTA is the starting point for me for that fundamental structural change for the Ukrainian economy.
Just to add, I think that the new government also needs to actually, because the trade restrictions with Russia and Russia is such an important trade partner are decreasing, they need to find new markets for the companies. And I personally, I don't think that, I think it's two things. It's a psychologically very important agreement. It shows clearly the strategy, and today we heard from the ambassador as well. He's saying that Ukraine is on the strategy towards joining European Union one day. So it's a psychologically very important agreement. Second, I'm sure that agricultural business, for example, will be able to benefit from reduced tariffs, and in particular when Russia as a trade partner decreases.
I would just add a couple quick things. I looked at the agreement in detail when it was originally came around. It's really kind of a mixed bag. And I would say that the best part of the package is that it forces, by necessity, the economy to become more competitive over time. And if you're selling into very competitive markets, such as Europe, which is very large and very diverse, and you also have eventual access to other free trade areas such as the US, it's very encouraging, as opposed to the customs union, which is a very large and open market, but after all, quite still controlled and not very competitive. On the other hand, it's freer trade, it's not free trade. A lot of the areas where Ukraine excels is already very competitive in Europe, where there's already a lot of competition and protection. And poultry is one example which is quite prominent, because although Ukraine could export a lot of very high quality poultry to the EU very quickly, the quotas that they have to ship to Europe are very small. There's something like 20 or 30,000 tons a year. There is, however, one benefit is that you can't ship more, but at least you can ship it tariff-free. So it doesn't help a lot, but it does help with the margin. So nearer term, really kind of a mixed bag, a lot of small cures, but longer term is very beneficial because it forces the economy up the competitiveness chain.
Thank you. Just wanted to add. So, I think in practical terms, what again I would expect is that, for example, there's protections. There's, for example, various policies. For example, if you look at a European Commissions and all the money they spent, and they have lots of policies saying, for example, that restriction participation of foreign vendors. So I would hope that becomes easier. That opens the market for us. Looking, in a wider context beyond pure economic impact, I would again hope that, the integration with the European Union would allow us to improve sort of cultural integration, to reduce cultural isolation, and that is a big thing for our business, for our industry.
May I add one thing? I think the time is of the essence as it is on this panel, but Ukraine doesn't have time to lose because it's lost enough time. And the point that you made is this resolve at the top is still taking some time to permeate to actual local administration. You still in the permitting process when you're investing something, etc. These are still a struggle for local businesses, and that is where I think the government needs to focus on, how to permeate that resolve down to the operating level at each of the regions.
That was a question I had on my list, in fact, was how local and regional administrations are to deal with and the extent to which they are opening up now to investment and are creating offices to help foreign investment, creating task forces, one-stop shop windows, whatever it might be. Do any of the other panelists have perspectives on that, on how Ukraine is to invest in that grassroots level?
I think Volodymyr probably is best to comment on that because actually regional administrations I don't think can do so much. I personally find, for example, when investing in Lviv, that they're extremely open. They want to help, but there is not much they can do because they're structural issues. I mean, again, back to legal system, law enforcement, that has to be in place because they can't help on that. But I give it to Volodymyr.
Thank you. Well, perhaps again, if you talk about our industry, it's perhaps less dependent on the local circumstances, so it's a bit different. But what we see, if you talk about, for example, about technology startups, there's I'd say emerging, for example, VC proposition in Ukraine. It's not really developed, but it's emerging fast. There's lots of private investments, but if I think about it, I think more about so if people in our industry start a business, they tend to, in Ukraine, because the local market is not particularly large, they tend to look global from the very beginning. So they tend to again look at what's available internationally. And I think if you talk about grassroots, in my context, that would be we would just from the very beginning look at all the different organizations and say angel investors or whatever who can help us, and not just in Ukraine, but so these connections emerge on a very low level. How this works.
Thank you. Going back to what kind of sectors are likely to be the most attractive for investment, and particularly with the EU agreement now signed. Richard raised the issue of the quotas that will still be in place, but people have told me, for example, in recent years that there are investors queuing up in the agri-industry sector to set up food processing operations, for example, once Ukraine is in effect within the EU single market. How realistic is that? Is it something we're going to see? Ukraine moving up the value chain in those kind of areas? Katra, is that something you could answer?
Well, one thing which I hear very little about, and that's the land reform, because in Ukraine you still cannot own agricultural or buy agricultural land, so there is no land market. And we, of course, as well as the investors in the agricultural sector, a big problem is again financing, because you cannot use your land as a collateral, and you can't. That would be possible, for example, in the West, that you use your land as a collateral in the bank. So I think that I'm still waiting to hear what is going to be. Is the moratorium going to be lifted, and when that would happen? And I also understand this is not possible to do before all the other structural reforms are in place, because it's a very complicated situation, and the process is going to be extremely complicated, and it would open up for corruption if it wasn't properly managed. So I think that as we are investing and renting the land, it's still possible. You can increase the yield, you can make a good profit. As I said, it's a huge consumer market with 46 million people. So sure, the food industry remains very interesting, but the question is if you can start buying the agricultural land or not.
I think just if we touch on that industry, I would say food, no, because the large international companies such as ADM and Cargill are already there, and you may sort out the political and the bureaucracy risk all that you want, but then you face the possibility that grain prices will decline, as we've seen, quite to the detriment of some Ukrainian specialists in that sector. But food processing, definitely yes. If we look at the food processing industry in Ukraine relative to, say, Hungary or Poland, it would be very underdeveloped. So there would be a lot of potential there. If you see the ADMs and the Cargill in Ukraine, you don't see the big manufacturers such as Kraft and large scale Kraft or Nestle. So that's certainly an opportunity. I wouldn't focus so much on the top-down food processors such as Nestle, perhaps, but maybe that's an area where some of the homegrown or some of the medium-sized European companies could take over.
There's also tremendous engineering know-how in this country, both including space technology, information technology. European enterprises could really set up a very competent, effective manufacturing base in Ukraine. In agribusiness, I entirely share your view that one would have to move up the value chain, not just look at primary production, even though there's a tremendous potential in the primary production and as well. But to diversify the markets away, you got to get into, and there are companies, there are examples of that. I mean, there's one of the most modern tomato processing groups that I know as our client in the south of Ukraine. We have Chumak as an example of value-added consumer good production, the MHPs, Ukra products. There are examples of how Ukraine can move up on the value of the chain. The other area is in the logistics. I mean, we are supporting private sector logistics investments along the Black Sea. I mean, just last month or the month before last, we signed a $50 million port facility for transshipment of agriculture in partnership with Lou Dreyfus and the local Kiev Brooklyn company. We're looking at another one of similar nature a few hundred meters down the line. And I think there are areas where Ukraine's position in geopolitical, the position of geography can be utilized. You can look at eventually this country is going to move towards energy independence increasingly. So how can you bring the partnerships with foreign companies in terms of servicing, then you go up into the upstream and downstream operations. So there are many areas that indeed Ukraine can offer a whole lot of promise.
Thanks. Right, so yeah, just to give a bit more perspective. Again, I think in the information technology we might be already partially there. For example, there's this notion of 3 versions or stages of IT outsourcing, but the third one would be basically product design and research and development. As I said, there's over 100 R&D centers in Ukraine opened by global companies. Then there's technology startups. So they don't compete with somebody local. They compete with likes of Google and Microsoft, and sometimes are bought by them. So it's a global scale.
Okay.
If I may just add on the IT, I think that the venture capital industry is also something which is giving very good potential for the future. And currently, if I've seen figures from European Venture Capital Association, Ukraine is one of the 3 last countries in Europe in terms of venture capital percentage of GDP. It's almost non-existent. It's, I think, 20 times more in Sweden, for example. And it's very little competition, and you have huge talent pool. And also, I think that's one of the sectors which probably will not be affected so much how quickly the reforms will take place, because you can still set up the companies in a way that they are not too dependent on the reforms that need to be carried through.
Thank you. We have a little bit of time left. I'd like to see if there are questions from the audience. I think there are some roving microphones, so let's try and take a couple. Just before the microphone comes around, if I could encourage people to identify themselves and also say if they are addressing a question to a particular panel member or to the panel as a whole. Let's take this gentleman there. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. My name is Robert Hoffman, Head of Research of the G20 Foundation. This is a question for Ms. Sard and Mr. Skladanivsky. You have mentioned the one of the, I think, most fundamental issues regarding the current reform issues, namely the fact that there has not been deregulation of current legislation in agriculture pertaining to the opportunity to purchase agricultural land. And in the circle of individuals that I've been speaking with in the last couple of months, it's the number one recurring question to say is that the change of legislation allowing international business community to purchase agricultural land is actually a prerequisite of the IMF. But the Ukrainian government, nor the NGOs or any other Western institution is actually able to give a timeline when this is to be implemented, even though we see that there is a great opportunity in the field of agriculture, but this bottleneck circumvents this issue. Do you have any ideas why this delay is taking place? And do you have any ideas what the timeline could be for the implementation of that? My second question from Mr. Skladevsky is the question regarding the IT sector Ukraine. Now, granted, the numbers that are being presented right now in the venture capital community are somewhat intransparent. I mean, but they say that the outsourcing volume of Ukrainian IT, the outsourcing volume is around about $1 billion, which is the combination of the entire outsourcing business of Romania and Hungary combined. Yet at the same time, we see a great disconnect between this enormous outsourcing volume regarding the venture capital internet startup scene. And this again goes along the lines with the information that Mrs. Sart provided, that venture capital funding in Ukraine is barely existable for classical internet startups or new technology startups. And how can organizations, institutions like the EBRD assist in this effort? Because if we look at these two fundamentally important sectors for Ukraine, agriculture as well as IT, there is the impression that for whatever reason, the Ukrainian government, with all the enormous tasks that they're confronted with, is not really able to address the need for information from in the international investor community. The question of when can we buy land in Ukraine, how can we refinance our venture capital efforts for internet startups, these are answers, unfortunately, that are not provided.
Thank you. Two important questions there. Sadly, we don't have anyone from the Ukrainian government to answer them, but...
I was going to say it is a very good question, and I unfortunately do not have an answer to that, but in a way it goes back how the land was privatized, and it is a very big mess, unfortunately, because the land is really, there are in small pieces, as you probably know, which is like either they are owned by local private individuals who have privatized that, or it's regional local administration, or state. So it's extremely complicated land ownership, and once they would allow the land market to function properly, you really need to make sure, if you don't want to have, it would be perfect for corruption to destroy this market. So you have to make sure that you have all the cadastre in place, land cadastre in place, and all the legislation in place that actually would allow you to do that. From that perspective, I'm actually glad that it hasn't been rushed, and rather the people who farm the land, I think more or less everybody, foreign investors, they actually work under the assumption that they rent the land for a long term. So I hope that one day it will be the case.
When I talk to the big agricultural companies, they list a lot of concerns. Obviously, the weather, the yields, the quality of the seeds, the availability and the price of the fertilizer, the gas price, the availability of financing, the availability of the capital equipment, and the competition. They very rarely mention the complications she mentioned about the ownership of land. It seems very complex in practice, in theory, but in practice, there are ways around it. And in fact, those who own the land, they may be relatively small owners, and a lot of them rely on the rental income. Some of them also work for the bigger agricultural companies. So it's not clear that even when the land reform will take place, it'll take place eventually, that the owners of land will sell to the larger domestic company or the larger real estate developer. So I think it's something which is important to focus on, but I don't think it's something necessarily that in a country, in in an industry, and as I mentioned before, prices have fallen a lot in dollar terms. It's not really something which I think needs to be the biggest priority for the time being.
If I might just do an additional commentary to that last answer, I do agree with the fact that the issue of land ownership is not necessarily the kind of fundamental key issue in the decision-making process of becoming active in Ukraine. But the underlying theme that I currently see within the current structures is that there is really not, there is the intention and goodwill on side of the Ukrainian government, but I don't really think that they have the organs to properly communicate these issues. And I think if we talk about the establishment of trust, the fact that Ukrainian government and affiliated organizations are not really able to provide straightforward answers is something that creates additional confusion and anxiety. If one says it's okay, how long is it going to take? And the answer is eventually, one day. This is a terminology that in Ukrainian context is worrying. So how do you perceive this issue of how the Ukrainian government and its organizations communicate the need for, or address the need for information from the international business community?
I agree, and you've brought up a very good point with the land reform. I myself was a believer for a long time that the lack of the land reform was something that was holding the industry and the economy back for a long time. You read opinion articles in the very well-known magazines and newspapers. You read IMF and World Bank reports. You read the commentaries from my counterparts at the larger investment banks. It's only when you speak to the companies involved in the sector themselves, when they list 10 priorities, 10 concerns, 20 things that deprive them of sleep at night, and the lack of land reform is maybe not even one of the top 20, maybe it's not even in the top 10. It's kind of difficult for the Ukrainian government to get out this message when there are so many messages they need to get out. To them, I suppose the biggest one they need to get out is that this government is going to stick together. They may have had their rivalries in the past. The prime minister may have been a founding member of Tymoshenko's party, but he's now rowing in the same direction as the president. But I think that is a very good point, that this is something that the government needs to do, which is to work with the private sector and foreign investors and put out the same common message so that everyone, domestically as well as internationally, can be rowing in the same direction at the same time.
Well, Ladima, I think the question was also addressed to you on the as this relates to the
That's
IT
right,
industry.
The second question.
Yeah.
Yes. Right. So I'd say you're talking about two distinct areas. So if you're talking about again IT outsourcing, that's quite an established area. I think most of the players in that area would be companies with international presence. There was consolidation probably 5-7 years ago, where leaders emerged, and some of the leaders already IPO'd. Most companies would be, I think, either foreign owned or have foreign investment already. So I think that area is quite mature to obtain investment but they really need it. If you talk about technology startups, I think any initiative aimed at making the larger community aware of the international opportunities available internationally and giving access to these opportunities, I think that'd be most valuable. So sort of making entrepreneurs letting entrepreneurs have easier access to international programs, leading international programs, maybe education. Is your question about VC or investment? Or?
The question for me was actually again about the observation in the market that there's a general consensus on the fact that IT personnel in Ukraine is highly qualified and that the outsourcing operation is remarkable considering how big it is in comparison to other EU, Eastern European territories like Hungary or Romania. And I think, and as a matter of fact, I think 50% of the British online gaming industry is being programmed in Ukraine. But despite the fact that you have this high degree of sophistication on the one side, you don't really see, again, your entrepreneurial initiative in Ukraine where you see, okay, we have the talent, we can accomplish things. I mean, the WhatsApp programmer was of Ukrainian descent, and he managed to get 18 billion. But if we look at what kind of funding is available to technology startups, I think it is less than $500 million cumulative, and most of that is just the intention of raising. I think last year's venture capital assets in venture capital fundraising for IT startups in Ukraine was less than 50 million pounds. So this disconnect of saying is we have IT venture capital startup fundraising of 50 million pounds on the one side, and on the other side we have 1 billion euros of outsourcing business. You again wonder, why do we have this same disconnect if the qualification and the infrastructure is obviously there?
Well, technology engineering requires several things. Engineering talent is one of them, but it's not all. So I think there are some challenges in terms of entrepreneurial outlook and perhaps management education. So any initiatives that would bridge that gap would help, I think. And as I said, I think to be a successful technology startup in Ukraine, you have to look globally. So I would think that people should have access. It would make it much easier if people had easier access to international programs like Techstars that open in London, for example, or similar things. So that's...
Thank you. I'd like to move on. There are other questions in the audience. So could we get this gentleman's hand first, and then we'll come to you next, if that's okay.
Hi again, I'm Sean from Guest Consulting Ukraine. Sadly, I have to leave after this afternoon because we're signing agreements to a national level and regional level. We've had great success in Ukraine, but I want to add to his comment, because actually it was one of my things, is with the EBRD, and I'm working with a number of your directors and programs with EBRD, but there is a serious lack of awareness in Ukraine for medium and small businesses to work with the IFIs and World Bank. I mean, what can EBRD do to take away the mysterious cloud of EBRD? I don't know if you're aware of this, but the medium and small businesses in Ukraine, yes, you have UKEEP, but UKEEP only has 2 people for the entire country. It's taken us a year of searching through all the available IFI programs, banks, and so forth to understand what's financially available in Ukraine. And what is EBR going to do to promote that is one question. The second question to Mr. Serd. One of the things we see is there's a lot of available legal structure that's in Ukraine, but again, you have to dig it out to find out how you can make it work. One of our rules in our company is, how do we fit the technical solution to the financial solution in Ukraine? We've got to match one with the other, and there's not enough information. If we could see promotion of that, I think would be greatly much more awareness on. Like, for example, EBRD spoke today. I mean, your clients you talk about are a $50 million project in a port, Schumacher, and sort of like high-end businesses, yet the medium and small businesses aren't getting the financing that they're really looking for because they have no idea how to even do it, to even start. It appears that there's a lack of awareness, and how is the IFIs and, let's say, EBRD going to change that? And again, these are some of the comments that he was making, is just a complete lack of awareness. I mean, one of the things that I would see is this is a great event today, but where are all the people that could really talk about their experiences on the ground in Ukraine to solve these issues? Number one. Number two, how can investors and the IFIs have a conference not to sit up and talk about what they are, who they are, but really give the information exactly what people need in Ukraine? How can we change that? How can we change it versus waiting for the government to change it would be my thing to the panel, is how can we step up and say, let's have a conference on exactly how to do it in Ukraine and move it forward.
Thank you. So some of the later panels may deal with some more of those issues. Shevki, though, on this issue of SMEs and raising getting rid of the cloud of mystery.
I hope there's no mystery about what EBRD is about. Our not just in Ukraine, but across the bank, supporting SMEs is a strategic priority of the bank. We do it in a variety of ways. We do it by putting money into private equity funds that could go and invest in small and medium-sized enterprises. We do it through provision of funding lines to local financial institutions and specify how those funds are possible or are capable of being used. And we target small and medium-sized enterprises, particularly for using that sort of conduit to reach out to small and medium-sized enterprises. And least but not last, we have a small business program, and we go out and deploy resources of management and other support to get the small and medium-sized enterprises to a stage where they can seek institutionalized money. One of the biggest challenges of the small and medium end of the spectrum is the unrecorded economy, and the need for institutions like EBRD and IFC to have a proper audits and proper records to be able to proceed to financing. But we are, through our small business support program, are providing that support. In the next few weeks, you will see that we're going to be opening a new office in Lviv with at least 2 of our friends to service the western part of the country, not just from Kiev. And as the dust settles, we hope to be able to open new offices in the south and east to again provide that support for small and medium-sized enterprises. And in our new strategy period, that will be 2015, over the next 3 to 4 years, we have a special focus on small business initiative across the bank, and particularly in Ukraine. So you will see us doing more individual transactions of 1 million, 2 million, 3 million range to respond to that need. Of course, we don't have the infrastructure to do the micro lending of 100,000 or 200,000, simply because that's not our business model. But we will go downscale to respond to the needs of the small business. I hope I answered your question. Yeah, thank you for reminding that. Indeed, at the end of this month, we're going to be going to Lviv first with our small business support team. Then we're going to go to Cherkasy. Then we're going to go to Ivano-Frankivsk before the end of November to introduce ourselves, to actually address the small and medium-sized enterprise community to understand how EBRD will work. And then we will replicate it to the north, south, and east. That is an essential part of our program.
So there's more to be done, but in terms of communication, but it is being done. Let's move on now. There is another question I'd like to take, and we're getting close to lunchtime. But Katrisa, the second part of the question was addressed to you.
Yeah, if I understood you correctly, you said there needs to be more awareness how to establish a business in Ukraine. Legal structure. Yes, I think actually one thing I came across, I've never seen in any country so many smart and qualified people go for the profession called lawyer in Ukraine, and hence I found so many good lawyers and law firms in Ukraine. So I think that as it comes to advice, you can get probably the best advice wherever could get. But the problem is that the laws are so contradictory, and again we are back in a structural problem that we need to change. It has to change so it's easier just to make business there, but I think otherwise the advice is excellent in Ukraine.
We're close to running out of time, but I'd like to take the question from the lady in the second row here.
Mariana Kozintseva, Stoneford Consulting. I have 2 questions, in fact, if I may. One for Katra and another for Shevki. The first question is on agricultural business. I completely agree with you that increasing agricultural yield is one of the best way forward for Ukraine's growth, since agriculture is a great sector. In your personal experience, what have been your challenges in increasing agricultural wheat yields that you've been dealing with? what would be your recommendations, practical ones, for the Ukrainian government if you were to pick top 3 to enact the increased yields going forward? My question for Shefki is probably a more complicated one, and that relates to the tax base. Right now, you've mentioned there have been attempts at tax reform. I know you praise them. I have to disagree with you. When I've looked at the attempted reforms, I found that the government tried to swipe a lot of them under the carpet. They did not make the system more transparent. They've took some categories of the tax code out and stuffed them under the subcategories. There are frankly 2 ways to increase tax revenues. One, to increase the taxation of the existing base. Another is to decrease the taxation and broaden the tax base by simplifying taxes. I'm wondering if that is one of the choices that you might or might not see for Ukraine, and if so, what would be your recommendation with respect to the tax reform and tax base broadening? Thank you.
Okay, rather broad subjects. We are running out of time. If you're able to give succinct answers to those, Katri, first of all, very quickly,
yes, I think
yields.
We actually in Western Ukraine have substantially increased the yields. I think we've doubled the yields for wheat compared to when we started. And I think the key is really that you use modern technology, because Ukrainian agriculture is hugely underinvested. Of course, modern machinery, good inputs, good quality fertilizers and inputs, but also the way the land has to be worked up, because a lot of land has been not used. So due to that, the yields have been increasing. But the biggest problem in agriculture is, of course, financing, because there is no working capital financing available. And now the situation is even more severe. And because of that, you need to buy it's a very sensitive industry. You have to buy everything on time. If you don't have cash when you need to buy it, then you buy worse inputs, and hence it's like really a circle of things. So, I saw one comment, I think, recently that Ukrainian government is cutting some subsidies for agricultural sectors. This, of course, does not help. So, if there was a wish list, working capital financing more easily available, and some subsidies.
I think you could have posed the tax question to my colleague here as well, because in the Baltics, I think the answer is clear. You simplify and reduce the level of tax, but you broaden the tax base. That is clearly, I think, also is the government's choice. However, sometimes when you are trying to renovate a very old house with all the old pipes and electrical connections, it is easier to tear it down and start from new than to try to fix all these complicated infrastructure. So maybe that is something that Mr. Bilus might also consider, just to reap everything off and start anew with a completely new tax code.
Okay, we have overrun slightly time-wise, so I apologize I haven't been able to take all of the questions, but perhaps you could raise them on a bilateral level afterwards. Thank you very much indeed to all the panelists for what I think has been a very fascinating discussion, and I hope the audience will join me in thanking our speakers for their time and their comments.